"We don't accept payment in the form of street performances," the manager announced loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. Maya's fingers tightened around the strap of her worn backpack, her eyes still fixed on the magnificent grand piano that gleamed under the crystal chandeliers of Bellini's, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle clinking of expensive silverware. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I can play really well, I promise." The manager's face contorted into an exaggerated look of disgust as he took in her appearance. The unwashed hair, the oversized coat with frayed edges, the mud-stained sneakers. "Do you even know which end of the piano to sit at?" he asked, triggering a wave of snickers from nearby tables. "This isn't some subway station. These people paid hundreds for their meals tonight." Maya's stomach betrayed her with a growl, so loud it caused several well-dressed patrons to turn and stare. Their expression shifted from curiosity to amusement, whispers circulating behind manicured hands. "Well, this is quite the entertainment tonight," called out a deep voice from a corner table. James Harrington, the tech billionaire whose face had been splashed across Forbes just last week, stood up with a champagne flute dangling between his fingers. "Tell you what, girl, why don't you give us a little preview? Show us what these talented fingers can do." He wiggled his own fingers mockingly, eliciting laughter from his business associates. "Security," the manager called with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Please escort our street musician to the exit." Maya's shoulders collapsed inward as the laughter swelled around her. In the brief moment before a uniformed guard approached, her stomach growled again, the sound somehow deafening in the sudden, curious silence that followed. Maya huddled on her thin mattress in the corner of the women's shelter, curled against the wall to create the illusion of privacy among the 20 other beds. The security guard's grip had left red marks on her arm when he'd escorted her out of Bellini's, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the burning humiliation. 6 months ago, she would have been eating dinner at a real table. 6 months ago, her mother would have been alive. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her only treasure, a framed photograph of her mother, Elena, seated at a grand piano with perfect posture, her expression serene yet somehow electric with concentration. The glass was cracked now, webbed with fracture lines from being hastily packed when the eviction notice came. "I tried today, Mom," she whispered, tracing her mother's face with a dirty fingertip. "I really tried." The memory swept over her without warning. Maya, at 7 years old, peeking through the door of Juilliard's practice room where her mother taught advanced students. Elena Petrova had once been celebrated, a rising star from the Moscow Conservatory who'd come to America with dreams of concert halls and standing ovations. Instead, she'd found a modest teaching position and single motherhood after Maya's father abandoned them before Maya could even remember his face. "Come here, Mishka," her mother had said, using the Russian endearment for little mouse when she caught Maya spying. "You want to learn?" And that was the beginning. Stolen moments after her official students left. Elena teaching Maya with the same rigor and passion she'd brought from Russia. "Your hands are small, but they will grow," her mother had promised, guiding Maya's fingers across the keys. "But your heart is already big enough for Rachmaninoff." The shelter's overhead light flickered, jerking Maya back to the present. A woman across the room coughed violently, the same hacking sound that had first alerted them something was wrong with Elena. The diagnosis had come like a thunderclap. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. Too advanced for anything but buying time. Maya closed her eyes against the memory of hospital rooms, the antiseptic smell that never quite washed away, the mountain of bills that grew as her mother shrank. Elena had continued teaching Maya between treatments, their apartment filling with music even as it emptied of possessions sold to pay medical costs. "Play for me," her mother had whispered during those final weeks. "Too weak to sit up. I want to see where your music will take you when I'm gone." But the music had stopped with Elena's last breath. The funeral costs had depleted their final savings. Without her mother's income, 17-year-old Maya couldn't keep their apartment. There had been no relatives to take her in. Elena's family back in Russia, long estranged. Her father, a ghost who'd never returned. The social worker had helped Maya apply to music scholarships, her only hope for both education and housing. Maya remembered sitting in the sterile office, explaining her situation to administrator after administrator. "Your mother taught at Juilliard." "That's impressive," they would say, their eyes brightening before the inevitable question. "And you've performed where exactly? Do you have recordings, competition awards, recommendation letters?" She had none of those things. Her training, though world-class in quality, had been private, undocumented. Her mother had always said, "When you're ready, we'll record you. When you're ready, we'll enter the competitions." But time had run out. "We need proof of exceptional talent for our scholarship program," each school had explained with practiced sympathy. Without a piano to practice on or money to make proper recordings, Maya's applications went nowhere. Her fingers twitched now, curling into the memory of chords. It had been 6 months since she'd touched a piano. 6 months of her talent lying dormant while she focused on mere survival. Which shelter had space? Which soup kitchen served lunch? Which public bathroom was safest to wash in? The shelter coordinator rang the bell for lights out. Maya slipped the photograph back into her backpack and tucked it under her thin pillow. Tomorrow she would try another restaurant, another hotel lobby with a piano. Somewhere in this city, someone would let her play. Somewhere, her mother's training, the thousands of hours of scales and arpeggios, the meticulous attention to dynamics and phrasing, the deep understanding of musical theory would matter as she drifted towards sleep. Maya's fingers continued their silent dance against the coarse shelter blanket, playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the piece her mother had always said would someday be her triumph. The security guard's meaty hand closed around Maya's upper arm, not quite painful, but unmistakably firm. She could feel the eyes of the diners boring into her back as he began steering her toward the exit. The smell of roasted garlic and truffle oil wafted from the kitchen, making her light-headed with hunger. "Wait!" The command cut through the murmuring restaurant like a knife. James Harrington stood, straightening his custom Italian suit jacket with a practiced flick of his wrists. At 6'2", with steel-grey hair and the confident posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed, he commanded attention without effort. The Forbes profile Maya had once seen in a discarded magazine at the shelter had called him the most ruthless tech innovator of his generation. "I believe we're missing an opportunity for entertainment," he announced, gesturing for the security guard to pause. "My colleagues and I were just discussing the arts before dinner." His aristocratic Boston accent carried perfectly in the suddenly quiet restaurant. "Perhaps our unexpected guest could provide a demonstration of her alleged talents." Maya felt the guard's grip slacken slightly as everyone waited for Harrington's next move. The billionaire reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it between two fingers as if it were a business card. $100, he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just play something, anything that won't embarrass yourself. Chopsticks, perhaps? Or is that beyond your capabilities?" His table of associates chuckled on cue. Maya recognized 2 of them from technology magazines, venture capitalists whose combined net worth could probably end homelessness in the entire city. "Sir, we don't normally allow," the manager began. "I'm hosting a $20,000 dinner here tonight." "Charles," Harrington interrupted smoothly, "I think you can make an exception for my amusement." The manager's objection withered instantly. "Of course, Mr. Harrington." Maya's eyes darted involuntarily toward the kitchen, where servers emerged carrying plates that made her mouth water painfully. Her last meal had been half a sandwich from the shelter's breakfast service nearly 36 hours ago. The $100 Harrington dangled would mean a week of actual meals. Harrington caught her glance and his smile widened, revealing perfect veneers that had surely cost thousands. "Hungry, are we? Well, that makes this more interesting." He tucked the 100 back into his pocket. "Let's raise the stakes." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the clink of silverware had stopped, as every patron turned to watch the drama unfolding. $1,000, Harrington announced, "if you can play something genuinely impressive. Not just plunking out a nursery rhyme, but actual music." He paused for effect. However, if you embarrass yourself, which seems the likely outcome, you'll work it off washing dishes all night. No pay, just whatever leftovers the kitchen staff might pity you enough to offer. Maya felt her face flush hot with humiliation and anger. She knew what he was doing. It wasn't about the money for him. This was pure entertainment, watching someone desperate enough to degrade themselves for his amusement. "That's not legal," a woman murmured from a nearby table, but quietly enough that no one acknowledged her. The security guard still had his hand on Maya's arm, waiting for final instructions. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, her mouth dry with fear and hunger. The rational part of her brain screamed to walk away, to preserve whatever dignity remained, but the piano called to her. The gleaming Steinway in the corner, she'd recognized the model immediately. A Model D concert grand, the same instrument her mother had played during her brief concert career. Maya's fingers tingled with physical memory, with the desperate need to touch those keys after so many months of silence, and beneath that need lay something else, something her mother had instilled in her since childhood. Never let them tell you what you cannot do. Never let them define your worth. Maya gently pulled her arm free from the guard's grip. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as she turned, not toward the door, but toward the Steinway. Her legs felt wobbly beneath her as she crossed the expensive carpet, aware of her dirty sneakers and unwashed hair, but keeping her chin lifted just as her mother had taught her for recitals. "This should be amusing," Harrington commented to his associates, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Either way, we win, entertainment or free labor." Maya reached the piano bench and stood before it, suddenly paralyzed by doubt. It had been 6 months. What if her fingers wouldn't remember? What if the humiliation these people expected became reality? But as she slowly sat down, adjusting the bench with the automatic movements her mother had drilled into her, something settled in her chest. The familiar position of her body at the keyboard felt like coming home. Whatever happened next, for just a few minutes, she would have music again. She closed her eyes and placed her hands above the keys, not yet touching them, feeling the weight of the moment and every stare in the room burning into her back. Maya's fingers hovered above the keys, a visible tremor running through them like leaves in a storm. The pristine white and black of the Steinway seemed to mock her dirty fingernails, and the grime embedded in the creases of her knuckles. She hadn't had access to proper soap in days. This beautiful instrument deserved better hands than hers, yet here she was, about to touch it in front of the most judgmental audience imaginable. The scraping of chairs broke the silence as diners shifted for a better view. From the corner of her eye, Maya spotted the glint of smartphone screens as patrons positioned their devices, eager to capture what they assumed would be an epic failure. The woman at table 7 whispered something to her companion that made him snicker. Covering his mouth with a napkin embroidered with the restaurant's gold insignia. "We're waiting," Harrington called from his table, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. "The clock is ticking, and those dishes aren't going to wash themselves." Maya placed her hands in her lap, trying to still their shaking. 6 months without playing, 6 months of her talent lying dormant while her body focused on mere survival. What if her fingers had forgotten? What if the music had abandoned her when everything else had? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath that caught painfully in her throat. Her stomach clenched with hunger, sending a wave of dizziness through her that made the room seem to tilt. The weight of everyone's expectation pressed down on her shoulders, crushing and cold. Start with something simple, she thought, just to warm up. Her hands returned to the keys, and she began with Bach's Prelude in C major, the first piece her mother had taught her with its straightforward arpeggiated chords. A foundation piece, her mother had called it. Something to center yourself with, but her fingers felt stiff, uncooperative. The first few notes came out halting and uneven, nothing like the flowing water they should have resembled. Someone near the bar let out a derisive snort. Heat flooded Maya's cheeks as she stumbled over a progression that should have been effortless. "I think we've heard enough," the manager said, stepping forward with poorly concealed satisfaction. "The kitchen staff is waiting for their new dishwasher." Maya's hands froze above the keys. The humiliation was worse than she'd imagined. Not just failing, but failing at something that had once been as natural as breathing. She began to rise from the bench, defeat bending her spine into a curve of surrender. "That's what I thought," Harrington said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. All talk, no talent, typical. The restaurant seemed suddenly cavernous, every cough and whisper magnified in the expectant silence. Maya could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, drowning out everything except the memory that chose that moment to surface from the depths of her despair. Her mother, sitting beside her during her last week alive, too weak to even hold a glass of water without help. "Maya," she had whispered, her once strong hands now skeletal as they covered her daughter's fingers on the small keyboard they'd brought to the hospital room. "Don't play what they expect. Play what you feel. That's where the true music lives." Maya sank back onto the bench, something shifting in her chest. These people expected failure. They expected weakness and inadequacy because that's what they saw when they looked at her worn clothes and unwashed hair. They had already written her story in their minds, and it ended with her hands in dishwater instead of on piano keys. She stared at the gleaming keyboard, seeing not just the instrument before her, but every piano she and her mother had ever shared. The keys weren't just ivory and ebony. They were memory and love, and the only home she had left. Her mother had given her everything, not just technique and theory, but the soul of music itself. Elena Petrova hadn't raised her daughter to surrender, especially not to people who took pleasure in others' suffering. Maya squared her shoulders and placed her hands on the keys once more, finding their familiar, cool smoothness both foreign and achingly familiar. The restaurant had grown so quiet she could hear the soft hiss of the heating system and the distant clink of glasses from the bar. Someone's phone camera shutter clicked in the silence. She closed her eyes, shutting out Harrington's smirk, the manager's disdain, the patrons' expectant faces. Instead, she let herself feel everything, the hunger gnawing at her insides, the grief that had hollowed her out, the rage at a world that could let someone with so much to offer sleep on a shelter cot. She let it all rise within her, a tidal wave of emotion too vast to be contained. Play what you feel, not what they expect. Her mother's voice was so clear, she could almost believe Elena was standing beside her, hand on her shoulder, guiding her as she always had. Maya took another deep breath, but this time it filled her completely, expanding her chest, straightening her spine, lifting her chin. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and focused. Her hands no longer trembled as they hovered above the keys for one final moment of silence. Then, without warning, she began to play. The first notes that flowed from Maya's fingers were not the simple melody everyone expected. Instead, the thunderous opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor filled the restaurant, arguably the most technically demanding piano composition ever written. The piece that professional pianists called the Everest of piano concertos, the piece that had broken careers and caused performers to collapse from exhaustion. The transformation was immediate and astonishing. Maya's hunched shoulders straightened, her spine aligning with perfect posture. Her hands, which had trembled moments before, now moved with supernatural precision and confidence. The girl who had stood meekly before them disappeared, replaced by an artist in complete command of her instrument. A waiter, passing with a tray of champagne flutes, stopped mid-stride, the glasses tinkling precariously as his hands froze in disbelief. At a table near the window, a woman's fork clattered against fine china as it slipped from her fingers. The manager's mouth hung open, his earlier smugness evaporating into stunned silence. Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard with impossible speed, executing the piece's notoriously difficult runs and arpeggios with flawless technique. The Rachmaninoff demanded not just technical mastery, but enormous handspans, a challenge Maya's delicate fingers somehow conquered through years of specialized training. The complex rhythms and constantly shifting dynamics poured from her as naturally as breath. What struck the silent audience most, however, wasn't just the technical brilliance, but the emotional depth she drew from the instrument. The music soared and ached with longing, each phrase shaped with such intention that the notes seemed to tell a story, of loss, of struggle, of defiance in the face of impossible odds. Maya swayed slightly as she played, her entire body engaged in the creation of sound, her face transformed by an expression of both peace and fierce concentration. In the far corner of the restaurant, an older gentleman with silver hair slowly rose from his chair, his napkin falling unnoticed to the floor. Leon Dimitrov, the legendary concert pianist, whose recital at Carnegie Hall the following night had been sold out for months, stood transfixed. His dining companions glanced between him and Maya with dawning recognition of what they were witnessing. "Impossible," Dimitrov whispered, barely audible above the cascading notes. "I have performed this piece for 40 years, and I have never—" His voice trailed off as Maya reached a particularly complex passage, executing it with a precision that made his eyes widen in professional admiration. Across the room, Harrington's mocking smile had vanished. He leaned forward in his chair, tumbler forgotten in his hand, brow furrowed in confusion that gradually transformed into dawning comprehension. The girl's filthy clothes and unwashed hair had created a deception, one he had eagerly embraced. But her hands told a different story. These were not the hands of an amateur who had picked up a few tunes. These were the hands of someone who had spent thousands of hours in rigorous training, guided by a master. Maya's eyes remained closed, her consciousness fully surrendered to the music. She was no longer in Bellini's with its judging patrons and glittering chandeliers. She was with her mother again, in their small apartment, Elena's voice gently correcting her phrasing. "No, Mishka, listen to how the melody breathes here. Give it space." Years of daily practice, of repeating passages until her fingers ached, of her mother's uncompromising standards and boundless belief, flowed through her and into the Steinway. Phones that had been raised to capture an embarrassing failure now recorded in reverent stillness. Not a single person reached for their drink or whispered to their companion. The kitchen staff emerged silently from the swinging doors, drawn by music that penetrated every corner of the establishment. When Maya reached the concerto's famous cadenza, the extended solo section that had intimidated pianists for generations, her technique somehow elevated further. Her left hand stretched to impossible intervals, while her right hand executed crystalline runs that seemed to defy human capability. The emotional intensity built with each measure, the music speaking of something profound and universal that transcended the circumstances of its performance. Dimitrov took several steps closer, his expert ear detecting not just accuracy, but interpretive choices that revealed a deep understanding of the composer's intentions. This was not mere technical reproduction. This was artistry of the highest caliber. As the piece drove toward its first movement climax, Maya's body arched slightly, her face tilted upward, caught in the rapture of creation. Her fingers, now moving with such speed they almost blurred, struck the final chords of the section with a power that seemed impossible from her slight frame. And then, silence. Maya's hands hovered above the keys, the echo of those final notes hanging in the air like suspended crystal. For one breathless moment, no one in the restaurant moved or spoke. The only sound was Maya's slightly ragged breathing. The spell had been cast. The truth revealed. The final notes of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece hung suspended in the air like crystal, vibrating with emotion long after Maya's hands had stilled above the keys. For 3 heartbeats, the restaurant remained frozen in stunned silence, a collective held breath. Then someone at the back whispered, "My God!" The spell broke. Applause erupted like a thunderclap, rolling through Bellini's with such force it seemed to shake the chandeliers. Patrons leapt to their feet, napkins falling forgotten as they stood in spontaneous ovation. An elderly woman near the front wiped tears from her cheeks without embarrassment. A businessman who had earlier sneered now pressed his hands together as if in prayer. Shaking his head in disbelief, Maya remained motionless at the piano, her eyes still closed, her body transitioning back to reality like someone emerging from deep water. When she finally looked up, the sea of standing patrons applauding her made her breath catch in her throat. Leon Dimitrov reached her first, his approach respectful, almost reverent. "I am Leon Dimitrov," he said, his Russian accent thickening with emotion. "I serve as Dean of Performance Studies at Eastman School of Music." He paused, studying her face with keen professional assessment. "Who taught you to play like this? Where did you study?" Before Maya could answer, the restaurant manager appeared at her side, his earlier disdain replaced by obsequious deference. "Please, miss, a table has been prepared for you. The finest meal in the house. On us, of course." His face had flushed crimson with embarrassment, his eyes unable to meet hers. "I cannot express how deeply I regret my earlier misunderstanding." More patrons surrounded her now, offering business cards, compliments, questions that blurred together in Maya's hunger-weakened state. Someone pressed a glass of water into her hand. The woman who had earlier whispered behind her napkin now asked if she could take a selfie with the brilliant pianist. Across the room, James Harrington remained seated, his expression unreadable as he watched the scene unfold. Then deliberately he stood and made his way through the crowd, which parted instinctively for him, despite the altered power dynamic. When he reached Maya, the arrogance had vanished from his posture, replaced by something more complex. "That was," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words, perhaps for the first time in his life. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, and considerably more than $1,000. He studied her face with new awareness. "But I'd also like to understand your story. How does someone with your talent end up—" He gestured vaguely at her worn clothing. Before Maya could respond, a server rushed up to Dimitrov, phone extended. "Sir, your wife is calling. She says videos are already going viral." The server turned to Maya. "Someone posted your performance on TikTok 5 minutes ago. It's already at 100,000 views." Maya's phone notifications would have been exploding if she still had a working phone. Around the restaurant, patrons were sharing footage, their faces illuminated by blue screen light as they texted, posted, tweeted. "Homeless Prodigy silences billionaire," read one caption that flashed by. "Watch tech CEO get schooled by street musician," read another. "Your name," Dimitrov said gently, cutting through the chaos. "The world will want to know your name." "Maya," she said, her voice small but steady. "Maya Petrova." Recognition flickered in Dimitrov's eyes. "Petrova? Any relation to Elena Petrova, who taught briefly at Juilliard?" Maya nodded, tears threatening for the first time. "My mother." Harrington watched this exchange with dawning comprehension, the full magnitude of his misjudgment becoming clear. This wasn't just talent he had mocked, it was legacy. The lights of Carnegie Hall dimmed as Maya stepped onto the stage, her elegant black gown catching the spotlight. 6 months had transformed her, not just the healthy weight she'd regained or the proper haircut that framed her face, but the quiet confidence in her posture as she approached the Steinway Concert Grand. The sold-out audience fell silent in anticipation. In the front row, James Harrington sat with hands folded, a subtle smile on his face. The tech billionaire looked different too, humbled perhaps. The viral video of Maya's restaurant performance had reached over 50 million views within days, forcing him to confront his prejudices in the most public way possible. The experience had sparked something unexpected in him, genuine reflection. Maya took her seat at the piano, adjusting the bench with the same care her mother had taught her. She looked out at the sea of faces, spotting Leon Dimitrov among the audience. The Eastman School scholarship had come first, followed by invitations from Juilliard and Curtis. Critics had begun calling her the most significant piano discovery of the decade after her first formal recital. The program in each audience member's hands listed tonight's ambitious repertoire, Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Liszt. But before beginning, Maya leaned toward the microphone. "I dedicate tonight's performance to my mother, Elena Petrova, who gave me everything, including her love of music." Her voice remained steady, despite the emotion behind her words. "And to those whose gifts remain hidden by circumstance, not by choice." Her gaze shifted to the balcony, where 20 teenagers sat in a special reserved section, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. The first beneficiaries of the Harrington Arts Initiative for Homeless Youth, a foundation established with a $50 million endowment after Harrington had spent weeks volunteering at the shelter where Maya had once stayed. Their stories echoed Maya's, extraordinary talents buried beneath the daily struggle for survival. Maya's fingers touched the keys, and Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hallowed space. The same piece that had changed her life that night at Bellini's, but tonight she played not from desperation, but from triumph. As the final movement reached its conclusion, Maya's hands danced across the keyboard with supernatural precision, her body swaying slightly with the emotional tide of the music. When the last note resounded through the hall, there was a moment of breathless silence, just as there had been in the restaurant. Then the audience erupted, rising to their feet in a thunderous ovation. Flowers rained onto the stage. In the balcony, the young artists watched with shining eyes, their faces transformed by something powerful, possibility. Maya stood to acknowledge the audience, her gaze finding Harrington, who nodded once in profound respect. Then she looked up to the balcony, to the young people whose gifts might otherwise have remained undiscovered, and smiled. As she took her final bow, Maya's thoughts seemed to hover in the air above the continuing applause. Talent doesn't know wealth or status, it only asks for the chance to be heard. And tonight, at last, the world was listening.